Hey, everybody. Just want to give a shout out to the sponsor of our video and podcast conversations of, by, and for the people. It's my friends over at the Rug Rack and Home Decor. I have known Miriam Thompson for over 20 years, probably when she started her business. I used to be her sales rep when I did marketing and media sales, and she does fantastic business. I've known her husband, her and Mike, for a long time. You don't stay in business 22 years if you do it the wrong way. I mean, you can, but then you don't have their kind of reputation, and they have a great reputation. I sent Miriam a thing, and I said, hey, send me some bullet points. So I'm going to read you what she sent me, but then I want to give you my personal testimony because I'm actually a customer. Here's what she sent me, and I love it, and I can validate all this. They focus on the shopping experience. They want to leave you with a mind full of rug quality, styles, and price points. You can find other things too, unique things to your home's interior like art, organic accessories, custom pillows, and a lot more. Carefully sourced rugs from around the world, and they tailor your shopping experience to fit your needs. They actually just moved to a new location in the last year or so, 1936 Central Avenue here in Chattanooga, 423-267-7847, therugrack.com. We bought a rug over 20 years ago from them, and some other things, of course, but the rug, still around, still gorgeous, still serving its purpose, still making the room that it's in look fantastic. So please go visit them, let them know you appreciate it. And I'm telling you right now, if you go and spend money with them, you will not be disappointed. Now, John Ballinger, our friend John Ballinger and Eric, when we first started this last year, this was one of the main things he wanted to, he was seeing was the administrative state. So there's this article by Forbes, and I just want to see if I can pull it up real quick. And it takes a bunch of different reports, and it comes up with how many different administrative states or administrative agencies we have. And I don't know if I can find it real quick. I know this. Over 400. Where's that at real quick? Let's see if I can find it. I love doing this live. 78 independent executive agencies, 174 components of the executive departments as units. There are over 430 departments, agencies, and sub-agencies, 257 different agencies that spin off of those. So what Forbes did in this article is they went and they found all of these different reports, and they started compiling them. And what they found was there's not one good place to go find all of the different agencies and sub-agencies and employees full-time, along with third-party contractors and vendors that they may incorporate. And why is that important? Because I think, rightly so, what really smart people, and we're going to bring two of them up right now in a minute, have been saying for a long time is who we elect is critical. But what happens is, based off agendas, ideology, they put these things in place that once they're gone, they are still there. And then we are actually being held accountable to people and to agencies that we did not elect. Now, I think I've said my part on that. I'm pretty much done. I'm spent. That's my educational level right there. But Eric Buchanan's going to make us smarter. What's up, Eric?
Hey, Clint. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. So before you tell everybody who you are and then you kind of set it up, did that make sense? Did that confusion that I just threw out there, doesn't that seem overwhelming? Did that represent the big picture of this thing?
Yeah, it absolutely did. Part of the big picture. And remember, that was also something that we talked about when we did our book report of the storm before the calm, that one of the things that's happening in America is every 80 years or so, we've reached a crisis point, and we have restructured our government. And one of the things that happened 80 years ago was the administrative state took off. And to the point now where, like you said, we really don't know how many agencies we have, and we get different reports from different places. There's no one central point of information to find out. They have overlapping authority. They have several different agencies have authority over the same thing.
Well, you have agencies creating other agencies now. They have their own.
Here's a simple one. If somebody uses a gun in a kidnapping and takes the person across state lines, the FBI has jurisdiction because it was a kidnapping, and ATF has jurisdiction because the person used a gun.
Well, and I'll break it down, and then I'm going to spin it to you we'll bring Matthew up, and you can both tell us who you are, and then you can set the premise. But I'll go one more than that. I heard Jen Psaki, back when we were doing the Afghanistan withdrawal, there was so much chaos. I heard, and I think it was about the Afghans specifically, I heard her say several times, we are trying to cut through the red tape and the bureaucracy to get things done quicker. I heard her say it on the thing, in the press conferences. And I thought immediately, so is every other business and small person in America. They feel the same way on a daily basis, because not only does that include about guns, what you just said, but try to get a business license. And what we're going to talk about today is when these administrations, this bureaucracy, this red tape, it starts getting used, like we've seen the government use big tech and big corporations as hammers and saws and tools for their agendas. Now we're starting to see the administrative state. It's been going that way for a while. So I say all of that. I'm going to bring Matthew up. Are you okay with both of y'all doing the introduction, and then you set the framework?
Yep, absolutely.
All right, here we come, Matthew Durham. 3, 2, 1. What's up, buddy?
Gentlemen, how you doing?
Morning, Matthew.
Hey.
All right, Eric, let's start. You tell us who you are. Matthew, after he gets finished, you take it. And then, Eric, the tennis match is back to you. Set us up.
So my name's Eric Buchanan. I have a law firm here in Chattanooga, and our team helps disabled people fight insurance companies when insurance companies won't pay under their disability policies. That's the main thing we do. We do a little life insurance and health insurance as well. I was a Navy aviator before I went to law school. I was a history major before I went into the Navy. So for basically a hobby or an interest, I love studying the Constitution, the United States history. I had classes in law school on administrative law, and I've continued to use those administrative law skills in my legal career, and I continue to study this stuff. And I am fascinated by and want to share what I learn about American political systems and where we are today. I'm also a volunteer with Braver Angels, an organization that helps Americans recognize that we are all Americans at the end of the day, and we can disagree politically, but please remember that we are all Americans together. And that's been a fascinating experience so far, and I hope to contribute a lot more and get more out of that as well. And that's led to some of these conversations as well, is remember that we can disagree about a lot of stuff. We don't need to yell at each other and scream at each other or worse. And maybe we need to start finding more of the common ground. Where do we actually agree on some of these issues?
All right, Matthew.
So hi, my name is Matthew Durham, and I am a PhD student at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and I am studying effectively how to facilitate collaboration between individuals and groups who are opposed in some sense. Typically, that's political opposition, but I'm certainly interested in other kinds of disagreement as well. I have a master's in psychology, with a focus in research, an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and before that, I worked in cancer research for about 8 years.
I honestly, before Eric takes it off, I felt a little bit like I was in a recovery meeting when you started. Hi, I'm Matthew Durham. I'm a recovering liberal. I'm a recovering American or something. I don't know.
I'm a recovery. My name's Matthew Durham, and I'm a technocrat.
Yeah.
Bow down to your overlords, everyone.
Come see the violence inherited in the system. That's a Monty Python reference for anybody that cares. All right, Eric, tell us what we're going to talk about, man.
All right. So I wanted to do kind of a basic civics lesson to help people understand where we are today with some of these issues that are really hot button issues. And I promise that we will get to something exciting and current, but you need to have some background to really understand it. So one of the things that happened recently is President Biden ordered the OSHA to issue a regulation requiring employers that had 100 or more employees to require the vaccine be mandated, or charge those employers $14,000 for each violation. I think they also could test employees or get the vaccine. Interestingly, we haven't actually seen a rule yet, and that's part of the conversation, what rule actually comes out from OSHA. But in order to understand, when you hear people scream, that's unconstitutional, or that's not right, they're not supposed to do that, a lot of people are yelling that. I don't know a lot of people have actually talked through why that may or may not be constitutional from several grounds, or why it may or may not be legal. And then we can also talk about whether that should be legal. That should be something that we as Americans agree to should be the power of the federal government and the executive branch in particular. So let's just for a few minutes break this down. And I'm going to try to just hit a few highlights and keep it simple, but there's a lot more to this. And if you start with one of the easiest things that a lot of people our age used to learn was Schoolhouse Rock. How does a bill become a law? And basically, we have three branches of government at the federal level. The president is the executive, and it's his job to enforce the laws under the Constitution. He's had other duties, like he's the commander-in-chief of the military, and he represents the United States as our chief person to foreign countries, and so he runs the embassies and all that kind of stuff. But his number one job is to enforce the laws. The legislature, Congress, under Article 2, their job under the Constitution is to make the laws. And then Article 3 covers the courts, and the courts are supposed to, among other things, interpret the laws and interpret them to figure out how they're really supposed to be enforced. And according to an old Supreme Court case from way back when, Marbury versus Madison, they also have the authority to decide if a law is constitutional or not. That's the system that we were given by the founding fathers. That's the idea of how our Constitution generally is supposed to work. And when we were kids, we learned in Schoolhouse Rock that separation of powers is how you ensured that if a law became a law, that everybody, there was some agreement on it, that it had to pass with the majority of the House and majority of the Senate, then the president signed it. And the president didn't sign it, then it had to go back to the House and Senate for a 2/3 majority. And if they did, they could override the veto. And if you guys even remember what that show was about, the law was that they wanted to pass is that school buses have to stop before they cross railroad tracks. So I use that as an example because one of the first things I'm going to start with is there are limits to the laws that Congress is supposed to be able to pass. And whether or not school buses in a state should stop before a railroad track is arguably something that's unconstitutional, according to a lot of conservatives. And what do I mean by that? Well, Article 1, Section 8 lists those powers of Congress. And so one of the other balances of power, in addition to the three branches, is that states are supposed to have a wider authority over people, that your local government at your state has what's called the general police power. They can control marriage laws. They can control murder laws. They have the laws about who you can sue for what. All those broad general powers that a government should have, that's supposed to be at the state level. And the federal government's only supposed to do certain things. And among the things they're supposed to do, for example, is to regulate interstate commerce. And that worked somewhat well for the first 150, 160 years in the United States. That balance. Now, along the way, there was a Civil War. That was a problem. And the Civil War somewhat changed the dynamic to make the federal government more powerful. One of the things from the old Ken Burns video that I think is compelling about that is when we used to say before the Civil War, the United States are, and then after the Civil War, we started saying the United States is one big country. And the federal government gained more power around the time of the Civil War, and it really started gaining power in the 1930s during the Depression. And we can have a long discussion about this, and we can circle back to it. No specific. I didn't mean to bring up Jen Psaki that way, but we can circle back around to the idea of how did we get to that point? And it starts in the late 1800s with European thoughts on good governance and having experts in charge that are supposed to be apolitical. And Woodrow Wilson was a big fan of that, and he wrote a lot of papers in the late 1800s, and that was his academic career till about 1910, until he got into politics, was this idea that if you put experts in charge, then you can take politics out of it, and we can have a better society without the masses and their voting getting in the way of what we really should do to make life better for everybody, and using experts as often as possible. And that was I think some people believe that. I think some people think that was those were good ideas, or at least they had promise it was worth experimenting with. And a lot of those things actually became ideas that were followed during the Great Depression, when FDR wanted to fix the big problems we were facing in society during the Depression. So three big things happened in the 1930s when FDR was president that the Supreme Court addressed that have really opened the door for this giant administrative state today. There were actually more than three, but I think these are three crucial ones. One we've talked about in previous episode of this show was the Wheatfield cases. And the Wheatfield cases were the cases where the question of, does Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce have a real limit? Does it have to be something that's really interstate? In order to say a truck has to have a spare tire or a bumper on it or whatever, does it have to be a truck that actually drives across state lines? Or is it enough that the truck could potentially drive across state lines? Or the truck is riding on a road that crosses state lines? Any of those questions. And what ultimately happened in the Wheatfield cases is part of the Great Depression legislation and regulation was that farmers could only produce so much product in order to ensure that the prices of those products were kept high. So a farmer had 13 acres. 9 acres was his limit. So he grew 9 acres of wheat to sell. But he grew 4 acres of wheat to keep for himself, to feed his family and to feed his animals. And the regulators came in and said, no, you can't grow on those other 4 acres. And he said, well, wait a minute, that's not for interstate commerce. That is just for me and my personal use. And that case ultimately got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yep, that affects interstate commerce because that is wheat that you could have put into the chain of commerce and you chose not to. Therefore, the federal government has the power to regulate that. And that's how powerful Congress is. That the limitation to regulate interstate commerce is so broad that it can regulate wheat you grew for your own use just because you might have used it in interstate commerce. And if you ask a lot of conservative commentators or even just law professors, not even necessarily conservative or liberal in the 20th century, that was a big moment that where the founding fathers said, here's what Congress and the federal government can do. What limit is less? What's left that you cannot articulate some way of affecting commerce if it's that broad? So that's issue number one is the Wheatfield cases. Then the issue number two, when the agencies were starting to be created in more and more during the Depression, was the idea of what is the power of the agency? How much power does it have? And the idea of the non-delegation doctrine was argued. And what's the non-delegation doctrine? Well, under the Constitution, who has the power to make laws? It's the legislature. It's Congress and the Senate. So what if they create an agency and they say, okay, agency, you have the power to write up all the rules for, and you pick a topic. In this case, one of the famous cases was the Securities and Exchange Commission, of how companies have to be formulated and set up. Well, that normally was something traditionally left up to states. It's also something that if Congress wants to get involved for purposes of regulating interstate commerce, that they should make the specific rules so companies know what to do to follow. And the Supreme Court said in a couple cases in 1935 that you can't do that through an agency, that you cannot tell an agency that they basically can write laws. And that was around the time that Franklin Roosevelt basically threatened to have a law passed that would expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court. It was called court packing, and we've heard that come up again recently. And basically the idea was, you conservative judges on the Supreme Court, you tell me something's unconstitutional for one of my agencies, well, I'm going to put a bunch of liberal judges, Democrat judges, people friendly to me on the Supreme Court, and we're going to change the rules. Well, FDR never actually did that, because not long after he threatened to do that, the Supreme Court started ruling more in his favor. And one of the things they did is they basically said the non-delegation doctrine is in theory still a rule, but if Congress sufficiently sets out the authority by which it has granted to an agency the ability to make rules, and it does so on a rational basis, that effectively there are not many limits created by the non-delegation doctrine anymore. So we need to talk more about this after I'm done setting all this up. But one of the basic problems is, so when you elect a congressman and you don't like what he's doing or she's doing when they vote for a certain law with certain rules that we have to follow, they can avoid responsibility for that, because they can say, well, that wasn't me, that was the SEC, or that was the Social Security Administration, or that was the IRS, or whatever 400 agencies they can blame it on. One of those 400 agencies creates a rule. That's not Congress's fault. We just gave them the general authority to regulate something. Don't blame me. And oh, by the way, can you send me your $1,000 campaign contribution? I mean, that's effectively what our congressmen do today, is they've delegated a lot of the important stuff they do to these agencies. The agencies run the country. And then the third idea, there's something called the Chenery case. And this is where this one's just kind of important. It's a little confusing, so I'm going to skip the confusing part and just tell you the basic rule. when an agency has to decide a specific dispute, and in this case, it was a company was reorganizing under the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission rules that had been put into place. And in order to comply with those rules, the company had to reorganize. One of the ownership groups of this big company didn't do the right paperwork, but they didn't know they didn't do the right paperwork because there weren't any specific rules. The SEC waited till they submitted their application, and then in considering this one case, they made up a new rule that excluded one of the ownership groups. And basically the rule was you can't try to reorganize in the middle of a time period when you're trying to comply with SEC rules, except they were forced to do it because there were new SEC rules. So ultimately, what the Supreme Court held was two rules, one kind of more technical, the lawyers use all the time, that the agency can only go to court and argue about the reasons that it actually used during the administrative process. So they can't make up a new rule when they go to court. But the second part of the case ultimately said, but if they want to make up a new rule during the adjudicative process internally within the agency, and that rule is consistent with their authority granted by Congress, then they can make up new rules even to facts that have already occurred to interpret the rules, the authority they're given by Congress. And a lot of the criticism of that is that obliterates the rule of law, because the Chenery company itself that was trying to comply with this didn't know what the damn rules were going into trying to figure out how to comply. And only after they were told by the agency that you did it wrong, I mean, it's Kafka-esque, because it's basically you don't get to learn what the rules are until you've already finished the process, and we can decide if you did it right or wrong. It's limited to individual adjudications one time, if an agency is looking at one set of facts, but it gives them incredibly broad authority where they are actually now being delegated the judicial authority to decide at cases, and then the courts have to give deference to that. And the court also said, our review of that issue is limited to whether it was within the authority granted to Congress, not whether it actually made sense or was fair. And so that's the Chenery doctrine, and that's a big part of it. And one last thing, and there's one more big one that we study in administrative law that fits in all this, and it's called the Chevron doctrine. And in the 1970s, the Supreme Court ruled in a case where one of the agencies regulating the Chevron Corporation articulated the agency set out a rule. And the rule was kind of iffy whether it was within the bounds of what Congress had said the agency could do to regulate the oil industry. Congress has a general rule for the agency that says you can set rules about the safety of selling petroleum products or whatever the other authority of the statute was. Chevron did something that seemed perfectly safe, but a regulator said, no, we're going to use our authority to regulate safety to say you can't do that. And it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately says in the Chevron case, and this is cited by attorneys all the time who deal with administrative law, that if the interpretation by the agency is reasonably within the power granted by the law that set up the agency, if it's reasonably within that statute, then the courts will give deference to the agency to interpret the law. So now we have administrative agencies that can decide for themselves and get deference about how much power they have when they are created and laws that create them. There's a whole class of administrative law that I took in law school. I took an advanced class in law school, advanced administrative law, that was a separate class that really delves into a whole lot more of this. And so there's a whole lot more to talk about. And I hope we can do some more in future episodes, but those are kind of the essential things to know, that at the end of the day, administrative agencies today in America have a boatload of power, and they have very little oversight by Congress, very little oversight by the courts, and very little oversight by the American people. And it really kind of boils down to who does the president put into key positions working in those agencies, and how much do they act out of self-interest or political loyalty versus doing what Woodrow Wilson back in the day promised us that they would do, which is sort of act like neutral experts, which that was the hope originally. That was kind of the promise of the progressive good governance movement, that these people would be put in these positions of authority and would do the right thing because they didn't have any self-interest somehow.
All right.
I know that was a lot.
Yeah, we're 20 minutes into this educational process. I don't feel I have any questions. I feel I wrote a lot of notes down. I just need to go study for the test. Holy crap. And I'm going to bring it to Matthew. I want to say two quick things though. One, and Eric, you can give me the thumbs up or thumbs down if I'm right. You and John Ballinger and I did a podcast several months ago about the insurance agencies. And I know from your history, a lot of times things that are written are given the big giant organization always gets a little bit of, I don't want to say leniency, but it always favors them. Like in the insurance business, the way things are written can lean towards the insurance agencies because they have a little influence over the people that are writing the laws that are inside that administrative branch. I know you and John have seen that personally quite often. And the other thing I wrote down was, this is why it's important when you have people saying we've got to vote for it to see what's in it. That drives me insane because we don't know what's in stuff and who's getting authority, who's getting the power, and what it means to me and Matthew and Eric. And I don't know. I took 400 pages of notes. I literally felt like I was in my class again in college going, well, I didn't know that. I got to write that down. All right, Matthew, it's to you, man. We were talking about the administrative state. He threw a lot of stuff out there. Take it any direction you want to go before we open it up for me to push back or ask questions. But how do you see what he said tying into today's world? Because we've got mandates now coming down to buy vaccines. We see what's going on in other countries like Canada and Australia through legal things, administrative states. What's your take on all of this so far?
I think the first thing I was struck by, one is I already had some grave concerns about the power and lack of accountability in many cases of the administrative state broadly. But after listening to sort of that brief rundown of some of the seminal cases, I'm inclined to think that it's even worse than I thought it was.
Yeah.
My previous thought was, well, my concern was that, in many respects, because these regulations are enforced by these agencies, perhaps these regulations come from Congress, but they don't always. They could be created purely by the agencies. I used to work with the FDA all the time when I was doing cancer research, and they didn't have congressional votes to determine new policies that would come down the chute for us. But regardless, my concern was, if you simply redefine the meaning of the words in these policies, you can apply it completely differently. So you can keep the same policy, and depending upon who's in charge, and who puts them in charge, you can act in completely contradictory fashion.
Real quick, you've brought that up in the past. This is why these big topics overlap. Because if we're at the same time, we've got this administrative state, Matthew, if we're changing definitions of man and woman or good and bad, or these vague things like what they deem rational or necessary, if we're changing these definitions, then we don't really have to change anything in the administrative state. It just changes the direction of the river a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, that was my big concern before listening to Eric. And now you've just given me several more, another one of which it sounds as though there's the people who are in these administrative departments don't have to function like your accountant or your investor, who might be required to act as in a fiduciary capacity. So that's where someone who's handling your money is required in the fiduciary role to act in your best interest and your best interest alone. They can't sell you a new investment because it benefits them more than another investment might, another portfolio might benefit them. They have to only consider how it benefits you. And I'm not hearing anything. Maybe Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not hearing anything in what you're describing that suggests that people in these administrative departments are required to adhere to some greater loyalty, some greater responsibility to benefit, some principle that they have to abide by. So I'm not hearing that, and I don't know if you have thoughts on something.
Yeah. So the simple answer is that Woodrow Wilson, using some of the European philosophies of the late 1800s that he was a big fan of, that talked about if we just put experts in charge, we'd have a more progressive, better society. And those people, typically, because they're such good people who want to do that kind of stuff, are going to be above influence and are going to be looking out for the interest of society as a whole, and are not going to be politicized. Therefore, that's the best people we want to have run these agencies, that are more independent and not subject to political whims. How do we enforce that?
I don't know.
I'm not answering the question because there is no answer, because Woodrow Wilson never proposed an answer. He asserted something that's contrary to what the founding fathers said in the Federalist Papers, which those people are always going to be self-interested. Now, who do they really answer to? Well, for the most part, they answer to the current administration. Well, so if Trump comes in and says, I don't like these people in this environmental agency that are actually trying to protect forests where we could do some perfectly good logging, mining, and oil drilling, he can put in people that are in big favor of more drilling, more logging, more oil mining, or more oil drilling. And so that happens for 4 years, and those people hire people within the agency whose resume consists of having worked mostly for Exxon or Pacific Lumber or whatever. And then the next president comes in and he only hires people that used to work for the Sierra Society or whatever they're called, or one of the other environmental groups. And yet the pendulum swings totally the other way. The balance for that is going back to the 1880s. There was something called the Civil Service Act. And the idea was that the president just couldn't wholesale replace government employees based on political whim. So there became a distinction between long-term professionals, people who worked within these agencies that can't be fired when the administration changes, and the political appointee positions, which are usually the director, the cabinet level position over the agencies, and a few higher level people. But ultimately, depending on how long they're in office, those people at those levels, if President Obama had 8 years in office, his agencies definitely were hiring more people that would follow his philosophies, or at least the philosophies consistent with the people he hired. Then Trump comes in and he's able to affect some agencies for only 4 years. So there is still a pendulum, but you also end up with this sort of, the dampening on the pendulum is all these professionals within these agencies. The problem is that the professionals within these agencies arguably are not really neutral people. That the conservatives, when Trump was being elected, they called it the deep state, and to some extent I think they have a point, that there's a whole lot of people that were not fans of Trump within these agencies. They might have been politically conservative sometimes, probably not. I think there's some studies out there that show that people employed by the federal government within these agencies are vastly majority vote Democrat, or at least they admit that they lean left. I don't know what the fix is for that. But the short answer to your question about what is there enforcing this, there's nothing enforcing this other than the little bit of political power presidents have to appoint the agency heads, who have a limited ability to affect those agencies, mostly by who they hire, because you can't fire anybody.
All right. My turn. Here's the frustrating part for me listening to this, two smart people talking, because I've got questions here on how we fix this. And then we got to talk about some examples. I want to get to the OSHA, how it's being used for the vaccine rollout, because I want to take these big topics and find headlines. So when people listen or watch this, they go, okay, now that makes sense on why I see it. But so you asked, we're talking about motivation. Where is their responsibility? Who are they accountable to? Well, here's my theory, and this is me dumbing it down. I am a customer of, I'm starting a business, or I have got XYZ that I'm in charge, I need to do. There's an administrative state representative I'm talking to. Normally, that administrative person, that one person, ground level, is got a supervisor. That supervisor has a mid-manager or a mid-level manager who then is talking to a big manager, who's then talking to a regional person, who's got a director over a national, who's then got a government liaison, who then goes to the government. I am 8 steps removed from anybody that can make a decision other than following the checklist that's on a freaking piece of paper, right? And so
hang on, Clint. Let's clarify this.
There's
lots of people that have the power to make decisions.
No.
What's way up that chain of command is anybody who's actually responsive to the American people because they were put in place by an elected official.
Well,
everybody else you just named has been hired by the agency. So they have a lot of authority to make rules and to enforce them on you. They're not responsive to anybody you elect.
Well, let me finish my thought up. I hear you, but I disagree a little bit. Here's what I mean by they don't have the opportunity to make decisions. Here's what I was meaning. First of all, if Matthew is my representative and I've got a business, he's coming to me with all these licenses and bureaucracy that I need. He doesn't have the authority to go, you don't really need that. It's no worries. Go forward. He's got a checklist in front of him that somebody 8 steps back removed the people that set the laws and put all this into play. He is just enforcing it. So if I want to, he's going to, you know what he's going to tell me? The same thing when I used to go buy a car. Man, let me check with my manager. Let's see what we can do. That person's going to go, let me go talk to somebody else. The odds are that Matthew on ground level does not have the ability to make judgment decisions unless it's inside a small framework. Now, this is where I was going with that, though. If you hire people and their livelihood is dependent on this government administrative job, I can tell you right now who that person answers to for the most part, and that's their family. So I'm motivated to keep my job. I may have to enforce rules that I do not necessarily agree with all the time, because I've got 3 kids, a wife, 2 dogs, and a mortgage. And I don't have a skill set that's going to allow me to make $50,000 to $70,000 or $35,000. And I'm at a place where I'm comfortable. So we have created the system, and we all can understand that. But we've created this system where I'm motivated by my family. I don't make the laws. Like you said, Eric, I can say, well, I didn't set the rules, dude. I'm just enforcing them. Don't kill the messenger. And now we've got a world. Back up a little bit. We've got a world now where I see teachers now. I see it happening with administrators. You post something on your personal page that goes against policy and the agenda, you get fired. You don't have to agree with the vaccine mandate, but you can be responsible for enforcing it, and you can do your job. Rah, go team. But on your personal Facebook page, if you post something that goes against it, you can be fired. I've seen it happen. There's headlines about it. So this administrative state we've built, I think, is almost like a real AI. We've built it, and now it's running on its own, and nobody knows how to unplug the damn thing. I'm done. There you go. That's my part. I've got other stuff written down, but
what's the name of the company that built the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator?
Cyberdyne.
What is it?
Cyberdyne.
Cyberdyne. That's it. Yeah, we've created Cyberdyne with petty bureaucrats.
But doesn't that feel like, so I wrote down, Eric, while you were talking and Matthew was talking, do elections even fix this?
You'd have to. The solution is you have to let courageous people in Congress that are willing to pass laws in Congress to take back Congress's authority from the agencies. And you have to elect a president who is willing to appoint people to the Supreme Court that are willing to go back and revisit some of these doctrines. There's a lot to read about this, but I'll give one example. The non-delegation doctrine just came up in another recent Supreme Court case where there was a federal sentencing commission, and the argument was that they shouldn't have the authority to actually decide what the proper sentences are for certain drug crimes. And the Supreme Court said, no, that was the authority they were granted by Congress. So Congress doesn't have to decide what the punishments should be for crimes in America, even though they're supposed to have the legislative power. It's okay for them to delegate that to a commission to determine what they should be. The good news is 4 justices said, oh, hell no. These are criminal punishments, and it's exactly what's within the realm of what the legislative body should do, and Congress should not have been able to delegate that. 4 justices were on that side, and I think they got it right for something that severe. Unfortunately, there was a majority going the other way. So it's going to take the Supreme Court and Congress both having more will to affect that. Now, what's the will? Where's that will going to come from? Enough American people becoming aware of this issue, and it's going to have to come from both the left and the right. So we were talking earlier about why is the left concerned about this? Well, there are two great examples I've read some recent articles on where where liberal/progressive law professors and political commentators are going, holy crap, it's time to revisit the non-delegation doctrine. Congress very clearly set up some rules under the Environmental Protection Act or some of the immigration laws, and then President Trump came in and basically used the agencies to undermine those laws, and they shouldn't be able to do that and go in the fly in the face of Congress. The problem is those same politically, the same, not the same people, but the same political side spent most of the 20th century saying, oh, shut up, the agencies really need to do this because they can fix all these problems, and it's okay for them to have all this power and stop standing in the way of progress.
Golly, I can't take notes this fast. Matthew, it's on you, sir. You got anything you want to add? Holy crap, I've got all this stuff I'm writing down.
Oh, the geeky people in your audience may remember a famous comic called The Watchmen. And the basic principle of the comic, much of it, is that you have these superpowered individuals who are sort of tasked with fighting evil in the world. But at one point, the comic asks, who watches the Watchmen? And where is the actual oversight for these agencies? If they can create their own rules, and people there cannot be fired, but only sort of replaced when positions open up by new leadership, new political leadership. Where's the oversight? I mean, they're doing all the oversight themselves, but who oversees the administrative state? Roughly, it seems as though the answer is generally no one. They have their own. They kind of do their own thing, and I'm glad to see people on my side recognizing that this is a problem and that it can create all kinds of weird pendulum swings with policy that can just, you don't know what the rules are going to be from 1 year to the next, because these things just keep flipping and flopping all across the place. I wish we would have seen it sooner. And it's, to some degree, it's surprising to me that there's a lot of concern on the left, generally speaking, for the degree to which power corrupts. And they're very focused across the board, I think, on opposing oppression, which is a function of coercive power. But they seem to be perfectly, or in many cases, perfectly willing to look past examples of them doing precisely that, and acquiring so much power and not recognizing that it's not going to be in your hands forever.
So one answer to that question of how does this stop? It's not as if 100% of the 20th century have agencies been allowed to just get away with whatever they want. There have been some Supreme Court cases where the agency has been told that's going too far. So that's who watches out. And often the agencies are being told you've gone too far in this particular case. So one particular FCC applicant for a radio license is told you can't have it, and then that case goes to court and the court overturns that ruling by the FCC. The problem is those are hard cases to win, because one of the other doctrines we didn't even talk about is when you have a licensing procedure or some other sort of quasi-judicial proceeding before the agency, where the agency makes a decision in an individual case, the court doesn't review that as if it's the agency itself. It doesn't give it what's called a de novo review. It normally decides whether the agency's decision was based on substantial evidence, was not arbitrary and capricious, and whether it was in compliance with the law, with deference being given to the interpretation of the law to the agency. So those are all technical legal terms I deal with all the time at work that basically boil down to the fact that you can occasionally get stuff overturned that an agency does, but it has to be something blatantly in contradiction to the statute, outside of the agency's authority, or just contrary to the facts of that particular case to get a court to overturn it. It's possible to do. And one of the things that the Congress did in the 1990s that was actually kind of helpful was they passed a law called the Equal Access to Justice Act that said if you got an agency decision overturned, that you can get attorney's fees for that. It doesn't apply to IRS cases, but applies to a lot of other agencies. And that was something that Congress kind of did to rein in the agencies. The problem is that didn't hurt the pocketbook of the technical term knucklehead bureaucrat who made the bad decision. That doesn't affect their career even. What it does, though, is it does give some relief to the individuals who have to deal with these agencies making bad decisions. The other problem is EJA fees are capped. I think the highest you can get right now, depending on what part of the country, is maybe $190 an hour, which is about 1/3 of the hourly rate you would have to pay a good attorney who fights administrative agencies and does a decent job. But at least it's something. I mean, it was a token thing passed when the Republicans had the majority in Congress in the 90s. But yeah, there's a lot of there is a number one problem is we've got to recognize the problem as a nation and acknowledge it. And that's going to require more liberals and progressives being willing to get on the side of the conservatives who have been, trying to blow the whistle on this for years, and recognize it's not good for either party's president to be able to come in and be a dictator.
All right, I'm going to throw this out there and throw in one other thing that I know it's kind of not the same, but I still see it as one of these problems, and that is you can throw executive orders in this, what I'm about to say too. What I have seen from Republicans and Democrats, especially over the last, 2, 3, 4 administrations, however far back you want to go. But I hear the rhetoric I hear the white noise much louder now, and it's this. If we don't get what we want, we're going to use corporations. We're going to use unions. We're going to use big tech. We're going to use administrative state. We're going to use the courts. All the courts aren't giving us what we want.
I've got a pen and a phone.
That's right. Well, if the courts don't do what we want, we'll circumnavigate this checks and balances. We'll just threaten to pack the courts. The corporations don't do what we want. We'll just bring them in Congress. We'll start bringing in big tech. We'll question them. In other words, if we don't get what we want, we've heard Biden say it. We've heard Obama say it. I'm sure somebody will send me a quote. Trump said it too, but I don't know if it's constitutional, but I'm going to try it anyway. And we just see this mindset now of screw the checks and balances. If I don't get what I want, I'll put stuff in place that quasi does what I want anyway and give just a finger to the American people in the Constitution.
So the ultimate check and balance is the people. And the problem we have, because I'm going to assume Trump said some of that same stuff you were talking about, is that people on the right were happy to go, it's about time we did some of that stuff. It's about time we stood up and
I agree with him. So let's leave him out of it.
Exercise. Yeah, I agree with him. So it was okay for him to exceed his constitutional authority.
Yeah.
But if Biden exceeds his constitutional authority, then he's literally Hitler. No, Trump was literally Hitler because he exceeded his constitutional authority. And at the end of the day, if we both sides don't agree that it's not okay to exceed your constitutional authority, then it's just going to keep happening as long as your side is doing what you want them to do.
Yeah.
And we can argue about and talk about what are the different problems. But part of the problem is what percentage of Americans even understand the separation of powers anymore? Some of the statistics I've heard, can you name the 3 branches of government? It's something like 70% of people can't do that. So how the hell are you going to get them to understand how the administration state operates?
Well, let's kind of tie this back into something that we talked about in the headlines. And I've got something, a big picture I want to say before we leave, but this whole conversation kind of started from I'm really, really going to try not to go down the Biden administration now reallocating medicines for people into states like the mononuclear antibodies.
Monoclonal antibodies.
Monoclonal, yeah. The fact that it's all equity now and Oklahoma gets as many as Florida, but it's not based off demand. But they make sure if everybody got vaccinated, and what they don't understand is there's a lot of people that need it in Florida that were completely vaccinated, and it's a political ploy. I think it's evil. There's Clint's take. But I'm not going to say any of what I just said. What I'm going to say is, Eric and Matthew, is we started talking about this because of using OSHA as a way to mandate for companies with 100 or more employees. I don't care which one of you takes it, but we've spent 40 minutes talking about this big administrative state. Just based off this headline, Eric or Matthew, is this the right thing to do? I'm not talking about the vaccine. People want to talk about the veracity of the vaccine or effectiveness. I mean, a way to do it. Is it constitutional? Is it something we should be doing?
So the reason I wanted, let me cover the actual technical stuff quickly, Matthew, then I'll let you turn to what it should be. One reason I wanted to set up how all this works is Congress passes a law creating a certain agency and tells that agency has the authority to regulate a certain aspect of life. And in this case, the OSHA statute, Congress said, and this is short, Congress finds that personal injuries and illnesses arising out of work situations impose a substantial burden upon and are a hindrance to interstate commerce in terms of lost production, wages, medical expenses, and disability compensation payments, and therefore Congress grants to this agency the authority. And then if you pull it up online, it is a list of duties and standards that the OSHA people have the ability to do. And including in those is to set rules that regulate the health and safety of workers. So if I'm a federal court and I'm looking at this as something that, does the agency have authority to regulate this? And by the way, I left this language out earlier. I think this is important. One of the things of the non-delegation doctrine is Congress has sufficiently granted its authority as long as the administrator of that agency, quote, can find an intelligible principle to follow. That's all that's required. That's the rule set out by the Supreme Court.
There goes those definitions again, though, Matthew, right? Who defines those?
Right. So the one line of defense or argument would obviously be mandating a vaccine like this was kind of clearly an end to run around what power the federal government should have. And is that really regulating interstate commerce to tell employers they have to do that? But if you actually go by just the actual administrative law rules, is it something within the intelligible principles of the act that the agency has Chevron deference to interpret? And specifically, the act starts out with that the purpose of Congress is to, I'll go back to it one more time, Congress finds that personal injuries and illness arising out of work situations affect interstate commerce. They may have the right, they may have the ability to do this unless courts are willing to actually say that it's a political subterfuge.
Has it got a timestamp on that? Does it say this power is given them from this date and it ends at, midnight, January 1st, 2022?
It was passed in 1970.
Never mind. Okay.
It doesn't have that's called a sunset provision. And no, they don't have a sunset provision on their authority. Most agencies don't.
Maybe everything like that should have a sunset provision and then it's reviewed within a couple years. Maybe that's one thing we could do if all these things are just sunset and it's, from here on out. Matthew, your take on all this, sir?
Yeah, I mean, I can possibly speak to the moral side of it, and sort of the leadership element of it. And we talked about this a little bit before we started, but when you're in a position of authority and you hand down a mandate, you are, when you're effectively using the coercive power of your position to force people to do what you say that they need to do instead of persuading them, you are tacitly admitting that that the people that you are forcing to do this don't trust you. And by actually forcing them to do it, you're making it all the harder to earn that trust back in the future. So just in principle, I'm very leery of any kind of a mandate, especially when it's of the nature of, well, it's for your own good, right? We get to decide what's in your best interest, and it's especially tricky in cases where there's disagreement between experts about the thing that you are mandating. One good example that's not perfectly aligned with this, but is related, is that the American CDC and the European CDC give contradictory guidance for whether or not the benefits outweigh the costs for requiring primary school students to be masked at school. The European CDC advocates against it, and the American CDC says that it is a good thing to do. And they're drawing upon the same literature, right? the same body of scientific literature they are drawing upon, coming to perfectly opposite conclusions. And this isn't necessarily the case for the vaccines. It is, they do both agree on the efficacy of the vaccines. But again, experts disagree on whether or not mandates are a good idea. And that is as it should be. One of the most famous and well-known physicists of all time, Richard Feynman, one of my favorite quotes from him is, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts."
That's a t-shirt. I love that.
And there's so many people who are, frankly, on my side, who are coming out and saying the science says X. And I've had to push back and say, one, how many of us really know the science? Frankly, how many of us have both the technical expertise to read the documents that OSHA presumably is using to justify this upcoming rule? And number two, how many of us have the epidemiological background necessary to understand the literature, the body of literature that underlies and gives context to the technical methods of analysis that they're using in this literature? And number three, how many of us have the other relevant expertise to weigh against the epidemiological piece? And we've had this conversation before. Do you just bring in epidemiologists, or do you bring in other kinds of people? Do you bring in economists? Do you bring in child psychologists? Right? All of these pieces are relevant. And if it's a presidential administration that's making this decision without engaging publicly, transparently in this conversation, where we look at the pros and cons from each of these different angles, and these experts are pitted against each other in a kind of intellectual gladiatorial combat for all to see, then none of us are really all that informed, frankly.
Well, it goes back to a question, though, especially real quick. One thing that frustrates me is for months and months, we've seen the Biden administration and leadership say how unconstitutional mandates would be. We see them saying it's not good. And all of a sudden we go back to we're not getting what we want, so we'll screw that. We're going to go ahead and completely ignore what we said. But it goes back to what you just said, Matthew, goes back to the fundamental thing that Eric and these conversations have had. What do we want from our government? And I know we keep taking it to these big things, but this headline, this administrative state conversation, having people that contribute from expertise in their area, it goes back to what do we expect? And is it a zero-sum game? In other words, we want 0 cases, 0 deaths. And if that's the case, then that changes how we approach the flu. That changes how we approach driving. That changes everything. And when if you want to see how a system works when it's out of control, I think you can look just to Australia and Canada, and you can see what's happening when they don't have the Constitution and people that have been drilled in this thing of personal freedom like we have. I mean, it starts with us in this country. And if we can't figure this out, I think we're into real big problems. So, Eric, is this conversation going back to what do we expect from our government? Do they get a pass from a lot of people for the mandates because whether it's constitutional or not, it's right because we need the government to protect us?
Yeah, I don't know the statistics, but I think it's an important question to ask. There are a significant portion of people that are still extremely scared of and worried about the virus, how it might affect them or especially their kids. And a large portion of those people are the ones that, even though they've been vaccinated, are pushing to say, but I don't feel safe because there's those others over there, those unvaccinated people, those almost like an undermention argument that that are less than human because they're stupid enough not to get vaccinated. There's almost
Howard Stern said that, by the way. He said they should stay in their house like Joe Rogan, just stay in their house and die.
That's the narrative that's going on, right? That if you're unvaccinated, that you are stupid, less than human, whatever it is. But even at its most generous, there's this, I've been vaccinated, I did the right thing, why won't they get vaccinated? Now, the problem with that argument, we don't need to get into a ton of this, is if you've been vaccinated, does it stop you from getting the disease? No. Does it stop you from spreading the disease? No. What does it do? It stops you from being as sick when you get it. That's apparently what we've figured out. And so, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that for whatever reason are still extremely scared, even though they've been vaccinated, and they think they've been told, you can see this stuff on social media, that they are demanding those other people be vaccinated because that will make them somehow feel safer. And that's what Joe Biden was playing into, that political consensus amongst his base that the unvaccinated need to be forced to do it. And I would also submit, and here's my more cynical point of view, his poll numbers were tanking because his popularity numbers were tanking because of the disaster in Afghanistan. And what better way to change the subject than a national vaccine mandate? Instead of talking about the latest story from Afghanistan, of which there are still plenty coming out, go see Barry Weiss's most recent podcast, which is fantastic, about an Afghan teenager that managed to get out. Go listen to it. It's really important. But if that's instead of talking about that anymore, we're now arguing over the power of the federal government and mandates. Well, that helps Joe Biden with a lot of people who are just shut up and get your vaccine and shut up and wear a mask because I'm still scared.
I heard a podcast the other day, and so this has not been, I've not looked in it any deeper, but I heard it from I think a pretty reputable source. And they said overall, an unvaccinated child is at as much risk as a fully vaccinated adult. And so with that being said, why would we be mandating vaccines? And now that doesn't count the children and adolescents who may have already had COVID and have some natural antibodies. That's the other thing I think we're leaving out of this. We have this mandate comes down. And now if Eric's if he's had COVID, has natural antibodies, they want you to get a vaccine anyway. And we go back to this whole experts arguing. There's experts that say the natural immunity from COVID is way better than the vaccine. It's stronger, lasts longer. And everybody's like, well, why do I got to get the vaccine? Because it checks the box and it proves that we have control. And that's, if you want to create terrorists, watch what we did in Afghanistan. There's 12-year-old boys over there, watch their family go through this, who were pulling for America that aren't anymore. If you want to create conspiracy theorists and people that become a little bit weary or leery of their government, do what you're doing now, because people now are looking at it going, wait a minute, I've had COVID. Why am I having to get the vaccine? And then they're getting vilified by their neighbors. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up as we come to the last few minutes of this, because Eric, I know you got a heart out, and it goes to Matthew, what you were saying, experts, right? This battle of experts. Recently, did we not see 2 people resign in the FDA that walked out because they were like, hey, you're saying that we should approve boosters immediately. Biden's been talking about it for weeks now. And they were like, the science is not there for boosters yet. We're not completely understanding this. And they said, no, that's not what we agree with. And now you have inside, if this had been Trump, by the way, it would have been front page news everywhere, no matter what you believe, that's true. But we have experts inside the same probably political mindset doing this. So what's Clint supposed to believe, Matthew? What am I supposed to believe, Eric? I'm just supposed to shut up and let OSHA do their thing? And real quick, does this also mean that OSHA will have the authority? Oh, I didn't think about this. Does this mean they have the authority to come out and require a booster from me in 3 months or 6 months?
All you have to do is change the definition of what fully vaccinated means.
There you go. Oh, I didn't even think about that, because there's a lot of people out there that will go, you know what, I'm going to get the vaccine. Screw it. It's going to be all right. And then 3 months from now, they may have had a reaction or be more scared or have more science coming out saying, like you said, you got the European, you've got I didn't even think about the boosters, Eric. I think that opens up a Pandora's box right there, my friend.
There's several questions that we don't have good answers to right now that I'm aware of, at least. And Fauci was actually interviewed, I want to say it was by Anderson Cooper last week. And they asked him a very reasonable and hard question, which was, is there any, what is the benefit, if any, of being vaccinated after you've already had COVID? And his answer was that we actually don't know. I've heard some people push back and say that there's evidence to suggest that that natural immunity is indeed superior to being vaccinated. And the rationale typically, from what I've seen, is, well, when you're vaccinated, you have now immunity to the spike protein, or at least your body is going to be more capable of recognizing the spike protein and fighting and pushing back against it. So of one of the proteins on this virus, your body is now very heavily tuned to be able to recognize it, so you can fight it off. But there's several other proteins on there. And if you've had COVID, then your body now has the capacity to recognize all of the proteins on the virus. And if your body retains the memory of those proteins within your B cells and your T cells, which for some diseases, like the 1918 flu, they've found there are cases where they were finding people with memory of in their B cells and T cells to that flu 90 years later, right? Yeah. So there are cases where you get effectively lifelong protection after you've had a particular infection. And we don't know the answer to the question when it comes to COVID-19.
Matthew, can we unpack that for the audience a little bit? Because this is something I think people get confused. They say that there's no known immunity, or the immunity wanes after 90 days or 6 months or whatever it is.
We don't know.
The first reaction that you have, whether it's a traditional vaccine, a modern vaccine, or actually having the illness, is your body creates antibodies, which are the substances in the body that actually go fight against the virus. But those go away over time because your body doesn't need them to actively fight the virus. The difference in your body for some indefinite period of time is that you basically have programmed the B cells and the T cells. They're like little, you can almost think of them as what are the programs now where you can like print, like a 3D printer creates something by programming in what you want to create, a doll house, or you want to create a certain construction device, or whatever it is with a 3D printer. Your body has created the equivalent of a 3D printer in these B cells and T cells that if it detects the virus again, it immediately knows how to print the antibodies out and get them out there. And that there's, from what I understand, there's a lot of science that basically says once your body has done that those B cells and T cells are programmed forever. It's why in my generation, if you got chickenpox as a kid, you don't get it again. You didn't need the vaccine. Now, some things people go, well, what about influenza? Well, the problem with influenza is that it has changed over time. So the original influenza that we were exposed to as kids, the first time we ever got the flu, we're not going to get that again. But if there's a different version of the influenza that comes around because it's somehow changed in some high density population area, then we might be more susceptible to that. But the more closely it's related to the one we already have, the more our body can fight it off. And from what I understand, having read a crap ton of this, we just don't know how long the B cells and T cells are going to be ready to fight the coronavirus, and for how long. And why is it that natural immunity is not better or is better than the vaccines
or therapeutics? But continue on.
And then there's the whole thing that's a whole different discussion for a different day. Is once you do get sick, it's not as deadly as it used to be because we have therapeutics. And then you have a question of what therapeutics are really working, what therapeutics are being downplayed, because if you downplay them, then they can't sell as many vaccines. And there's my conspiracy theory for the day.
Well, I sent a video to both of y'all. I hope y'all watched that video of that ICU nurse. I hope y'all watched the video I sent y'all, because she talks about some stuff that I think is very plausible. But Matthew, anything you want to say to Eric, what he just said? If not, I'm going to ask a quick question.
Well, I mean, Eric, yours and my reading of the literature is aligning 100% at this point. And I want to just clarify, obviously neither of us are doctors. Please talk to your doctor if you have any questions about this, that your doctor will certainly be more qualified than we are.
I am a doctor of laws, so listen to me when I talk about the laws. Don't listen to me when I talk about
I'm medicine. A doctor of love, Matthew. I don't know what your problem is, buddy. Holy crap.
There's something Clinton got from the 70s.
Yeah.
There you go. Marc Courvoisier.
Yeah. Yes, I hear you, Matthew.
Right. Yeah. So I think what we're trying to do is just summarize what we've seen as far as what the arguments are and sort of what the questions that we have yet to answer with a high degree of confidence. So in this sense, I think we agree with Fauci that we do need to have more research on this question. I think it's very plausible to assume at this point that the body's capacity to fight any virus is going to be similar, but it's also going to depend upon how the virus changes. And if, for example, this particular SARS-CoV-2, if that spike protein mutates,
go ahead.
Then we have a problem, because everything that we have vaccine-wise is specifically targeting that protein.
Well, and to me, that's where the mandates come in. We're mandating something that we don't have. We've been in this, literally, the vaccine's less than a year old. We don't have any real long-term data. But I'm sorry, Matthew, I interrupted you.
Yeah. And so we desperately need to know, what is the, and I'm sure that there are technical terms for this that I don't know because I'm not an epidemiologist, but we need to, and it needs to be transparently communicated so that the informed general public can make informed decisions, frankly. But how likely is it that that the spike protein is going to mutate to a point where the vaccine is just not as effective at recognizing it? With all of these variants, what is the likelihood of that happening? And then 2, compare that to natural immunity that comes from having been infected by it. That's something that's incredibly crucial. My son has had it. I don't know if I've had it because I haven't been tested for T cells and B cells, but I'm vaccinated, and I want to know what degree of protection can the vaccine offer, and then I have to be able to assess that against what we know about side effects for the vaccine. There was a study that came out of the UK recently, and recognized by their major medical authorities, where they were talking about the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis, which are both heart inflammation issues, being higher for males aged 12 to 17, I want to say, than any risk of hospitalization for SARS-CoV-2.
It was 6 times higher.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, ratios, right? You need to know what the actual 2 risks are. Right. They're both very small, but still a 6 times increase, right? Frankly, I am more concerned about heart inflammation, which is potentially lethal in a very small number of people, but it still is. And that's something that we need to be able to take into account.
But see, a lot of that, when you go to your doctor, which we should all go to our doctors, I think they're getting discouraged because of all this administrative state pushback. Right. And everything on social media has got to have the little opaque cover that says find out more about COVID, because doctors now, even, I think, are getting to where I really don't need to talk about the side effects because the patient may decide not to do it. And then I am somehow not following protocol. I just sent you both an article that talked about why the WHO has said for the month of September. Now, headlines change, but it said pull back on the booster idea for a while. Go read that article about what they now found the effective rate for the vaccine in Israel. If you want to have topics to talk about, the vaccine effectiveness data that we are getting is all over the place. This is by a name I cannot pronounce. She's an immunologist at the University of Arizona. It's really hard to know what to make of all this. And she goes on to talk about the Pfizer biotech vaccine now in Israel, the Ministry of Health, with this new infection going back to, are there going to be any more mutations, went from 95% effective to 39% effective. So when you start reading stats like that and you say it out loud, I'm not saying you shouldn't have the vaccine. I'm saying I'm vaccinated. Clint Powell's vaccinated. And I have a problem that they don't even know if it's going to work for me, but they told me to get it anyway. And I did it because I listened to my doctors. But if you see stuff like that and smart people can't ask questions and we're told to be quiet, then that's the main problem. And we go back to this administrative state that's pushing through things that, if it violates the Constitution, and it goes back to Eric's question, and even if it doesn't violate the Constitution, Is it the right thing to do? And by the way, Eric, you threw that out there at the very beginning, and it's not a small thing. For every violation a company has that they don't get the test, it's $14,000 per violation per week. It'll put them out of business.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that authority goes through. So let me back up something Matthew said a while back, and I think this is crucial. That if the administration's to the point where they have to mandate this vaccine, they have lost the trust already of the people that they should have been able to convince to get the vaccine. And by mandating it, they are making that trust issue worse. And I would add to that the social media combined with government propaganda storm of downplaying any side effects of the vaccine, downplaying any dangers of the vaccine, and combined with this message, just get the vaccine, was the worst way to approach it for doubters. As Americans, we got used to in the last 15 or 20 years hearing that if you take a medication for pick the really rare bowel disease or depression or whatever, at the end of that really cute, nice commercial was this long list of this may cause, impotence and paralysis and blah, 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 blah. All these scary things. But I was like, okay, that happens to 1% of people or less, and I'm not going to worry about it because if I need this treatment, I'm going to get it. Let me ask my doctor about blank. But when we have a similar low incidence of side effects from the vaccine, but we're being told you're not allowed to talk about that. And oh, by the way, you just need to get the vaccine and you need to trust us. And oh, by the way, really big footnote, they still have not taken away the grant of immunity to the manufacturer. So if it really does have side effects, you can't sue them. Just because the FDA approved it doesn't change the rule that you can't sue the manufacturers. So don't tell us it's 100% safe. Tell us the truth and let us make our own risk assessment. And the more that they refuse to tell us the truth and have an open and honest discussion about the side effects, the more I think you built up the resistance, because seeing stuff on social media that showed you were lying or twisting the truth was worse than just having the open discussion. And this goes back to what we've learned from that book, Revolt of the Public, that the old authoritarian institutions, the CDC, the U.S. Department of Health, the White House, they are still living in the 20th century where they think they can make an announcement and everybody's going to go, yes, sir, and follow it. When we live in an information age, and if you try to hide the side effects of something, that's worse than just addressing it up front. When you try to hide something and mandate something, you have lost the trust of the people. And so that's why I think why it's such a legitimate national debate. And let me say one last thing before we run. We were looking earlier for what are the solutions from this. One other solution to these big picture problems is recognizing that government agencies at the federal level should not be one size fits all, whether it's a vaccine mandate or a minimum wage. The original Constitution, and to some extent what still exists, is each state is supposed to be its own laboratory of democracy. And if California wants to mandate the vaccine, people can stay in California and feel safer. And if they don't like it, they can move or fight it within the legal system in California. If Texas or Florida doesn't want to mandate the vaccine, people can move to Texas if you want to be around people that don't like the vaccine, or you can move out of Texas if you're on the other side of it. When it comes from the federal level, we don't have those choices anymore. And that's one reason why I think we have so much polarization in America. Instead of having the opportunity to work locally with your government to make the best decisions for the people, the majority of people in that area are willing to live with, and that have a similar culture and a similar risk tolerance. Instead, we've kicked it all up to the federal level where it has to apply to everybody.
And Joe Biden gets to say the governors can either do what I want or get out of the way.
Yeah, and that's a violation of Article 4 of the Constitution, which is the part that says those things that the state are supposed to have control over are things the federal government is not supposed to have control over, which also goes to Bill of Rights number 9 and 10. It also goes to Article 1, Section 8. Those are all things that are traditionally an important part of our Constitution, that the states should have more autonomy over certain things, and healthcare is actually one of them.
Matthew, anything before we wrap it up, sir?
Just briefly, and maybe we can hint at a future discussion topic. One of the things that I'm concerned about, Eric, you talked about having courageous leaders who are not necessarily as beholden to certain loyalties or special interests, who can make these judgments independently. And while I am, if I'm not butchering your comment there, I think that might be part of the solution. I just want to offer maybe something that pushes back against that a little bit, even though I love the idea. We have an example of a setup where we had that in place and it wasn't enough, which is academic tenure. The idea of academic tenure being once you get it, you don't have to worry about losing your job. You are free to pursue your interests and say whatever you want without having to worry about being canceled or fired or whatever it may be. And that is a wonderful ideal, and I love it as an ideal. I wish we had people who did not have to, and both. I've heard this both from Biden and from Larry Elder, who was just running for governor in California. That both of them recognize that you have to, as a politician, spend an immense amount of time raising money from all of these different people and interest groups. Right, that is the majority of your job in many cases. I wish that weren't the case. I wish that people could just run, and the power of the purse strings was not as heavily influential. But even in cases where it isn't as influential, and like with academic tenure, it's other things that are, and it doesn't protect you. And I know very few, a precious few people with tenure who are willing to say whatever they want and have no fear about their employers still pushing back and doing terrible things to them to prevent them from speaking. So there's something else there, and maybe we can figure or talk about what that might be.
Eric, do you have time for me to say my last 60 seconds, or do you need to go? And
I really need to go, but finish 60 seconds would be perfect.
Well, it's going to be less than that. I think this is what happens, ladies and gentlemen. We talk about the administrative state. I think it's what happens when we become untethered to principles as a country, whether it's through your church or through patriotism or through certain beliefs, and why these conversations are so important. When you don't have a touchstone, then the human heart will run to power. It will run. The people who are willing to put everything aside to go get the power will go. And without principles, we then are just floating around with only our opinions. At some point, these open-minded conversations have to be had with the goal being in mind of finding solutions to prevent these things from happening. Talking about things are great. Eventually, having solutions is there. But if we don't have principles that we can all agree on that aren't based off agendas, then we're going to have people take over these big institutions from corporations and bastardize capitalism. They're going to bastardize our government. They're going to take over your churches, social medias, big tech, and they're going to run to the top because we don't have principles to hold them in place. That's my theory. All right, Eric, you got stuff to do. We got some big specials coming up, though, dude.
I know. I need to get back with you for times because I can't wait till we start talking about the Bill of Rights. And I think we should do it on the Constitution generally, but let's talk about that more later because I really need to.
Sounds good. Talk to you later, Eric Buchanan. I want to say bye. See you, buddy. Hey, Matthew. Awesome. It's good seeing you too, man. I appreciate your time. Last thing, I'm going to give you how's your research going? Your research going good?
Yeah, it's going well. I've started the project where we're looking at the degree to which different attitudes about tolerance are predictive of different levels of psychological well-being. We are knee-deep in that project now. And I'm also, I've talked about it, I think maybe once with you guys on this podcast, but the Love Your Neighbor Forum.
Yeah.
We've had to postpone the initial event because we were concerned that we would lose a lot of people participation because it's an in-person event due to the Delta variant numbers here in Chattanooga. I don't want to lose that many people whose perspectives we value, and we personally invited all these people. So that's something we've had to postpone. We might be looking at doing that virtually and sort of testing out the format and seeing how well it works. But my hope is that I can work with other folks at UTC to turn that into not just an event that can help people, but also bring to bear some of my research acumen and get the university behind it a bit more and sponsor it and really challenge some other ideas that I think are genuinely difficult and toxic and make conversation harder.
Just throw this out there real quick, and I know you got to go too, and I hate to keep you, but this is a random question. Is it possible, or they already exist, classes? We didn't have to have this when I was in college. Could you take a class that if I'm a conservative, is there a class to talk about openly differing of views where you don't get in trouble from the higher ups, or is that supposed to be history? Is that supposed to be? I mean, where is there a place to learn how to navigate this? Are they ancillary? Are they third party things?
There are certainly third party options like Braver Angels, and we talked about that too.
And your organization,
certainly that's what we're trying to do as well. It's still very much in the early planning stages, but
it seems to me though that would be kind of what college is for, isn't it? To think, to let you crystallize what you believe in and how to think through that. Isn't that supposed to be a little bit of college?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you took philosophy courses when you were at UTC. That's one example of a place where it's supposed to be that way.
Well, I went to Carson Newman, but if I'd have gone to UTC.
That's right. Sorry, I keep forgetting.
Yeah, it's okay. You're just UTC centric, dude. That's
I remember you said you had buddies at UTC. That's
I have a lot. Yeah.
I keep forgetting.
Yeah.
But yeah, and in that it certainly used to be the case in history. It used to be the case in psychology and sociology and several other disciplines where it was in fact current, like economics. Oh my gosh. University of Chicago is famous. It's what was his name? He's a famous conservative economist. I'm forgetting his name now. Worked with Glenn Lowry to a degree. Oh gosh. Anyway, I'll forget it. I'll remember it later, and I'll post it as a response to this.
Okay.
But just absolutely like cutthroat. Get in there and fight for your ideas, and everyone is you're gonna do the same thing. Everyone's gonna be against you to the extent that they disagree. But through that process of dissent and disagreement, maybe you don't change your ideas, maybe you don't actually change your beliefs, but your beliefs will be better because of it. Another good example, Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg, amongst the two best friends that you can imagine, agreed on nothing when it came to the law, but absolutely adored each other and felt that the other person was absolutely delightful.
Being challenged though creates a certain amount of confidence and strength, and it also gives you the confidence to explore where you may be wrong. Because if I'm insecure in what I believe, I really don't want to explore things that I may be wrong about, because then what do I do with my beliefs? My identity is wrapped up in my beliefs. And I think that's where churches go wrong. And I think that's where governments can go wrong. And I think that's where we can go wrong with our ideology. If I am what I believe and I'm not secure in that, then I can't be challenged, because then it's really not a reflection of my ideas. It's a reflection of who I am.
Yeah. And while I'm not a Christian anymore, one of my favorite things to see is when Christians do take up the call to the defense of the faith.
Oh yeah.
And are willing to say, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to defend my position. I'm going to come out here and we may not agree, but I'm going to defend what I believe. And, as opposed to sort of the just wishy-washy, it's all okay, it's cool. Or if you disagree with me, you're automatically Satan, right? Like, take up the call, defend your position, and do it with people who do strongly disagree with you. You will be the better for it. Even if it's frustrating.
Well, and I've done that in the past about, I'm a Christian, and one of the things that it's a default, and it can be seen as a scapegoat, which I understand, but unfortunately, it even says it in the Bible, whether you believe it or not, it says it. And it says, you got to work out your faith, first of all. It also says you just aren't going to know everything. It says it. And I don't know another place in the world where we're supposed to know experts don't know everything. That's why we have these conversations. They disagree with each other, and they are experts in the field. And so when it comes to religion or faith-based anything, there comes a point where you can work it out through facts, anecdotal, self-stories, and then it's something you have to settle on that is you. That's just got to be, and me and you've talked about it. There comes a point in science where if I keep asking, well, what happened before that? Well, what happened before that? There comes a point in science where they take a little bitty leap of faith and they think this is what we think happened.
Yeah. Or we don't know.
That we don't know.
And both of those are uncomfortable to be in.
Yes. And it's supposed to be uncomfortable. Dadgummit. It's
Right.
we're supposed to have to figure this thing out called life, man.
Yeah.
All right, dude. I'm not going to try to convert you. You're not going to try to convert me, but by golly, we sure as heck can talk to each other.
Hey, defend your position. I'll defend mine. And even if we don't persuade the other, that's fine. That's not what it's about.
When you and I have a beer, mine's pure and yours is evil. As long as you understand that. I'm just kidding. There's karma. I'm going to have a bad day now because I said something stupid.
That's
hey,
fine.
Matthew, dude, I always enjoy when you come on with us, and I wish
Likewise.
you a good day, my friend.
Likewise.
Yes,
Take
sir.
care. Have a good week.
Bye, buddy.
See you.